Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well, doing well. A couple things to go over. I guess we'll talk a little bit about coronaviruses and things like that, and maybe a Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah.
And how we're going to save the world. So I don't have over expectations, but we'll keep plugging away at making a point here and there. But the one item that I caught, and you noticed as well, was Trump was made a criticism about the fact that people were saying, yes, the number of cases going up, we're in trouble. We have to have a second shutdown. A second wave is coming. And Trump makes a simple position, a statement, which he's made it before, and we've mentioned it generally speaking, and that is that there's a lot of coronavirus infections or activity out there, not necessarily illnesses. And that's why the numbers don't mean anything. Because if you don't count 1 million people who had like a little cold or didn't have any symptoms, the numbers really don't mean a whole lot. So, everybody wants to do more testing. And they blame it on the statisticians, but the statisticians at CDC, they make up some stuff too, and they, project and say they know something. But it wasn't them as much. I imagine there was a motivation to do testing because they were racing to get a good test. And there might be somebody making money on the more tests they do, the more money they make. But anyway, the tests were done, and Trump brags that we had more testing than any other country. Probably true. And so we have all of a sudden a surge in the number of people who have had the virus, so to speak. But I don't think they break it down and say, well, some had a positive test, but they had no symptoms. Some had a positive test and they had a cold, and and then there were some that got sick. So that does make sense. If you test more, you're most likely to have more cases. Trump said that, but the rule is that anything that Trump says is wrong. Now, we hope that we're capable of supporting the things he says that are reasonable and logical versus the things that are a little off the board.
Well, I think this article shows really everything that's wrong with the media. It is such a snarky piece. Trump on coronavirus. If we stop testing right now, we'd have very few cases. This is why he's dangerously wrong. Is the author Andrew Romano? Okay, it's put out as a straight news article. Obviously, by the headline, it's simply meant to ridicule the president on this. Okay, if you can, Andrew Romano grew up in California. He lives with his wife and kids and plays in a band. Okay, that's great. What is his expertise? How was he able to judge this? The whole purpose of the article was to ridicule, but what Trump was saying is that we'd be showing less cases if we didn't have the most testing in the world right now, which we do, which is the case. If we stop testing now, we'd have very few cases, if any. And the author says Trump's nonsensical if a tree falls in the forest suggestion that somehow coronavirus infecting would cease to exist if we stop testing trying to defect is dangerously deluded. The president is deluded, is what he's saying. But the fact of the matter is, as you suggested in your opening, the CDC run around testing millions of people every year to find out about the seasonal flu? Of course not. They make an estimate based on hospitalizations and other things about how many people they expect might be infected. We know for a fact that at least 99.9% of the people who were infected with the virus survived the virus. And if you take away people certainly over 80, you have it even less. So the idea that testing is absolutely essential to beating this viral outbreak is something that's invented by the people who do nothing but scare the American people and have destroyed the economy and taken 40 million jobs and introduced a new kind of totalitarianism into the country.
Well, of course, we'd wonder what Anthony Fauci is thinking about these days and where he is on this issue. But an article shows here that says top coronavirus expert Anthony Fauci says he hasn't talked to the president in a couple weeks now. Maybe that's good news. Who knows? Maybe that's why Trump is speaking out more strongly about he isn't being stopped by this clown. But anyway, he did have a couple of comments, and they weren't a whole lot different than what he has said before. This is Dr. Fauci. He said that he would like to see a more modest approach to this. It shouldn't be on lockdown. It shouldn't be all or nothing. You shouldn't lock down everybody at once and then release everybody at once. You got to use good common sense and have a little bit here and a little bit there. And because he's the one that's deliberate and more moderate and will work this all out. But he also said that a second wave is not inevitable. That's good. The statistics show that they hardly ever occur if they do. It's just a continuation of whatever they want to call it. And he says, well, no, we will not have to have a lockdown unless we need it. And so he says, unless we need it. But I don't think that is the case as long as you do what we tell you.
Yeah.
So he's back in the news. And I watched a little bit of the enemy's programs last night on TV, and they praise him like he is the last word on immunology. You know, that he knows everything about it, and all we have to do is listen to him and it'll be okay. I would think that when somebody very objectively sorts all this out, they're going to realize that his partnership with Gates probably they were probably the instigators par excellence. You know, that they had a lot of clout, and they got into the administration. They had titles and money and business associations and reasons to get a lot of people to support them, whether they're making pills or vaccines or whatever. But they've had their say and they did. But I think in time, already it's starting to shift, that people are starting to wake up. Well, why does he get so much attention?
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell me why he's getting so much attention.
Well, you had a great statement. They treat him as if he's the last word. Well, the reason he's the last word is because they've erased all the other words. Remember the doctors from California who did that long analysis that was very interesting, and it was certainly worth debating. Well, YouTube yanked that. What about some of the people we've had on our program? Our chemistry professor from Canada has had his studies yanked about the mask. So he's the last word because the censorship we have is erasing any other word, you know, that's contrary to him. But, you know, the second wave is, I think you can make a very good argument that the so-called second wave is really the suppressed spread of the first wave. They did everything to lock everything down so people couldn't get the first wave. So now when it's starting to spread as it normally would, they can, of course, turn on the fear and call it a second wave. But, you know, the vice president, who we've been critical of for a lot longer than he's been vice president, let's put it that way. He had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and there were a lot of problems with the piece, and there are a lot of, you know, things in it we wouldn't agree with. But there are a couple of good points that he makes, and it's worth considering. He said now less than 6% of the tests that are done come back positive. And of course, we would add there's notoriously high false positives anyway, so you'd have to knock that down a few notches. He also said by the end of February, we'd only performed 8,000 tests. But now the U.S. is performing 500,000 tests a day, 23 million total tests. And here's the part that he really gets right, and I think this is why we're even talking about it. The media has tried to scare Americans every step of the way. These second wave predictions are no different. And that, for all of his faults, Pence nails it on the head right there, hits it on the head right there.
You know, we have a problem in this country about understanding what freedom of speech is and the First Amendment. And now there's a big argument going on about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996 and how to regulate it because, you know, the social media, they were very young at the time, but they ended up with an exemption that they didn't have to be responsible for what they said because they were going to be a platform.
Yeah.
And they would make it available to people, anybody that needed it. It's sort of like using the internet or using your telephone or what. It was not going to be regulated. But it turns out that it didn't happen. Government found it, and they probably knew it from the very beginning because government helped set them up. It was very convenient for the social media to serve the government, information that was valuable to the government for their regulation. But now the censorship is an issue. It's not a platform, it's a censorship, it's a program, and they get exemptions from it. So automatically we'll take away their exemption, but it's not quite so easy. Then who's going to do it? So it is a real mess, and there's some people both sides. They've had some executive orders, but they're going to have some legislation to try to straighten this out. And there's no easy solution, or maybe they'd have done it in the past, but I do think that a little bit of free market economics, a little bit of common sense could solve this problem. And that is, if it is a publication, if it's a newspaper, we didn't have these kind of debates. It wasn't perfect, but my assumption was, and I think most people agreed, that you could have a newspaper and you could print what you wanted. You couldn't. We couldn't go into this paper and say, you print this, but the paper was limited. They can't get in there and slander you. And they would get sued, and they would lose some suits too. So that was available, but that's not what we have now. You can't sue, the social media, and they have this exemption. But removing the exemption, then is the government going to do it? What are they going to remove the exemptions from? Who's going to replace it? Because they haven't picked the free market.
Yeah.
They haven't chosen to have the free market, and the big thing is the inability to distinguish between government and private. If you have a private system and responsibility and liability, that's one thing. But once you get them together, this again is another example of something we just talked about yesterday. Corporatism, big corporations involved in government, the government regulations, and then it got politicized because the censorship has anything to do with telling the truth. Matter of fact, the censors are the ones that are telling most of the lies. They're the ones who are committing the slander, and they're getting away with it, and they don't suggest that there are other ways. And it's not going to be easy to do. It's unfortunately an example of corporatism, just like in the whole issue of coronavirus. It's corporatism, drug companies involved, and special interests, the people who manufactures the vaccines and all these kind of things. It's a mixture of getting benefits from the government. And the worst part of that is the fact that the system that we have now is blamed for all the problems we have because it's too much capitalism. It was too much freedom, and look at what we have. Of course, I've been trying to distinguish those two things and tell people this is not capitalism that we're dealing with. This is corporatism, which is on the verge of being fascist.
A lot of libertarians would argue in places like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube that these are private entities and therefore they should have the right to do whatever they want as a private company. And there's a good argument to that. Certainly we would agree with it in theory. But the fact is, and you've touched on it too, is that these private companies, so-called, really have done the bidding. They're co-conspirators with governments on all sorts of things. We talked about it on the show a while ago, where the state governors and state authorities called up Facebook and said, please take down any posts that people make directing them to where they can protest the lockdowns. And Facebook said, sure. And other, Facebook and Twitter and the other social media, they've partnered with organizations like the Atlantic Council, which gets tons of money from the U.S. government to slap a fake news label on something the U.S. government doesn't agree with, a perspective that the U.S. government doesn't agree with. So in a way, they're wanting it both ways. They're doing the bidding of governments, yet somehow at the same time pretending that they're completely private entities.
And it's real hard to get people to understand that there is a different system, one that basically was endorsed by the Constitution. They didn't invent corporatism, even though there was this tendency for a long time. And all you'd have to do is look at the cooperation between corporations and big business and military-industrial complex. Everybody knows something about that. But it's that combination that is so bad, and most people they don't think about, well, is there another way to do it. What else can you do other than refining and redoing your regulations? 1996, things have changed. In that regulation they wrote in there now, or maybe there's a defect in it, so we'll just modify it. Maybe the modification will help. Some people think so. Some people aren't that optimistic. And the position I've taken over the many years is sometimes tinkering isn't a very successful way of dealing with it. And I never liked, taking a $10 billion bill and reducing it by $2 million and strike something, say, oh, well, we're moving in the right direction. But it's the principle of the thing, as long as they're able to do it. And that's why, yes, let them tinker. Hopefully it'll improve. But what people need to understand, that private markets are quite a bit different than what we have today. And there is something in between where the government doesn't own, they don't admit to ownership. But if they have control, that's the whole thing about fascism. They have control. They don't always turn the businesses over into the government's name. Matter of fact, that's good. They can regulate them and blame them if things don't go well, But that's something that is missing. And where is it missing from? From our universities.
Yeah.
They wouldn't teach or even imply that there is another viewpoint. They wouldn't introduce that. It's a government intervention program and pseudo ownership, and we will say, maybe the pros and cons on this, and then turn it into a political fight and think that they've really solved the problem.
And one of the current events why we're bringing this up is that the report, we saw it on Zero Hedge, we've seen it elsewhere. Jonathan Turley has a good piece that we also put up on the Ron Paul Institute website. But they put out a new legislative plan, which is suggested legislation, to put up a modified version of Trump's executive order. Remember, Trump put out a few tweets and Twitter put some warnings on it and it got him pretty mad. And so he put out an executive order that doesn't have a lot of teeth. I think this would modify it and give it the strength of being enshrined in law. And as you say, would roll back to Section 230 protections. But the problem is in the concept. And in this way, I think both conservatives and liberals completely get this wrong. The goal is to make sites more vigilant in how they police content. Well, I don't know if that's such a good idea. Well, what the liberals want more aggressive censorship of what they call hate speech. Now, of course, hate speech is any speech they don't agree with by nature. Well, conservatives, they want more aggressive pursuing of liberals who say the same kinds of things conservatives say, but get away with it, and that happens a lot. There's plenty of examples from that. But really, both sides are wrong in this. They both want more censorship, and I don't think the Department of Justice's approach of eliminating these protections will give us less censorship. It'll just give us more. No, I want you to do this. No, I want you to have more of this. The solution, ironically, and the other thing they want to do is they want to make the sites more responsible legally for what goes on in the comments section. And these can be very spicy, and there's a lot we even have some folks in our comments section that say some pretty salty things that we do not agree with. But the point is, in Zero Hedge, they were demonetized by Google, and part of it was for the comment section. But both Twitter and Zero Hedge and a lot of these other platforms, they had a really pretty workable thing in place. For Twitter, if you saw a person who was saying something that you thought was racist or disgusting, you simply blocked that person. You'd never see another post. You didn't have to worry about being triggered or anything. Gone. The same thing is true in Zero Hedge. If you're a registered member of Zero Hedge, you can block any of the other commenters. You'd never see a racist thing. You'd never have to deal with it. And that really is a solution to kind of make us each our own individual editors, and we can decide if we want to go into the mud, sling the mud, or if you want to not expose our ears to this kind of stuff.
When I first saw the article, I misread it because I thought it said demonize, not demonetize. And maybe that's true. But here's another story out today, which is, to me, fascinating. It's using the tools of the left and what's going on, something that we wouldn't endorse, but using it against the people to mock it and maybe actually do it in the meantime until we get some sense in here. But this is an article that says, U.S. Supreme Court just accidentally created a new way to end all big tech censorship against conservatives and Christians. That gets my attention. And then the answer, gender identity. And there's a recent case, I guess, where they ruled that if you're in one of those categories where it's gender identity, I mean, that is as sacred as individual liberty is to us, gender identity. If you can identify, and I thought, well, that might be 3, 4, 5 different groups of people who are gender identified, but I'm wrong on that. There's 30 different kinds that New York State recognize gender identity, and then they under that, if you can be identified, you get placed under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So guess who has the least amount of protection under this that aren't gender identified? And the article suggests that's what the individuals who come up short. If there are 30 different ones, can't we ever stretch it and say, well, maybe Christians can have a gender identity, and maybe there'll be other kinds of gender identity. I'd like to have one as a libertarian identity. I used to needle some of my progressive friends in Washington. I'll say that we're very much, opposed to all the discrimination they put up with. I said, you don't know anything about discrimination. You ought to be the lonely libertarian in the Congress. Then you'll know what discrimination is all about. But anyway, the point is made, that whole thing, the system is just totally out of whack, but they should be faced up to this. Somebody should try it just to make the point, that it's so foolish. Maybe someday people will say, well, there should only be one identity for when you're starting to talk about rights. Individuals, that's the most important group you can have is individuals, and they should not be identified any more than that. So you just have, if you're an individual, you get the same rights as you're an individual that belongs to who knows what. And if there is indeed, laws and rules and regulations and really not just hateful, deceitful and dishonest penalties of certain groups, that's a different story. But I think that this whole thing, it's just gone crazy here. I wonder what's in that 30. I don't think I could read the whole list. 30 different gender identities, but that's the sacred thing. They look at that just as seriously as you and I might look and say, liberty is an individual issue. We have our liberties because we're an individual, and we gain this in a natural, God-given way, and that's it. So I don't know what will come of this. I guess this was a recent ruling that they had that said that gender identities under 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Well, that's one way out of it, I guess. I'll just close by returning to our good friend Andrew Romano, who had a great time ridiculing Trump for what he said about testing, producing more positive cases as if that's somehow a revelation. As usual, you get down to the lower part of Mr. Romano's news piece, and he lets out a little bit of truth, a little squeak of truth comes out. Because after all of his scare tactics of the first several paragraphs, toward the end he said, for now none of these states look like the next New York City. The percentage of residents infected with COVID remains relatively low. Testing capacity is high, and hospitals are not scattered thin. Well, that's kind of what we say every day. So why did you spend 3/4 of the article scaring everyone to heck and ridiculing the president for saying basically the same thing? And that, in a nutshell, is a problem with our media. And that's why we try to bring an alternative perspective with a little bit of humor. These are pretty grim times, but we try to use a little bit of humor to cheer everyone up every day. That's why we do what we do, and I would encourage everyone, if you're not subscribed to this channel, please not only subscribe, but click the notifications, even though you know when we go live, at least so you'll be reminded there's a little bell next to where you subscribe. Please do that so you can keep in touch, so we can keep in touch with you and keep each other informed, because we do indeed look at your comments. And by the way, a big shout out to our Super Chat people, because you do literally help keep us going. So thank you very much.
Well, we have to be careful when we make fun, because there was a time when I used to make fun when the minimum wage law, which we don't believe in because we believe that is not a good system, that the government knows what a person earns and that sort of thing. But when the minimum wage was probably less than $5. And if they were working hard, they probably did deserve more money, but we approached that differently. So I said, all right, then, it's $5 an hour, and you want to take it up to $6 an hour, which, percentage-wise, that's a significant increase. I said, why don't you make it $15 an hour? And that was so outrageous. But guess what? Those you have to be careful. You know about that. They're liable to do it. So I'm going to make one of those types of suggestions, not with the idea that I think it's a good idea, but somebody else. No, it would serve an interest to show how foolish I am. And that is counting sick people. Okay, then all this been going on, all the fudging and the statistics that are given, the data we have to look at, on the coronavirus. So if they're going to continue to do that, and we're involved in counting sick people, whether they have the virus, whether it's active, whether they ever have any symptoms, they have to also ask the same question about influenza and compare the two. And if they don't know the difference, that they can't report it. They'll say, well, it sounds like coronavirus, like the death certificate. Sounded like they had coronavirus, and we'll build the numbers because we have an agenda. So, but they should, if they feel so duty-bound to count people for our health reasons, then make them count influenza. And guess what I think would happen? I think, there would be a lot of people have influenza, and history shows that there was a tremendous number of people dying from influenza, and they still do. But now, probably the people dying from influenza are being counted in coronavirus. It's so bad, this mixture of the do-gooders in government that is used for pure, crass political reasons and corporatism that they can make more money and all. It's just a real mess that we have. And that is why the separation of medicine and the government is a good plan. That would be ultimately. But in the meantime, make them count the influenza numbers and the corona numbers and see what really happens. They might have a little bit of enlightenment, but nevertheless, as it's going now, the propagandists still have a lot of power and say, although we're making inroads into that propaganda, because a lot of people are just saying, I think it's delightful that there might be, one of the reasons why they did this is to stop Trump's having rallies. I think that excited them. So I just think that if he could have that big rally, and they came up with this idea, well, we don't want anybody tested from the rally because maybe nobody will get in and make us look bad. But I think, I understand there's a lot of people who want to go to his political rally, and the only thing I would suggest, if there's a lot of politicking going on, why doesn't he have it in Texas or Oklahoma or someplace and get 25 acres and say, come on, we're gonna have a big party. But the authorities that can't stand him, the state officials and the politicians around, no, he has no right to have that many people come see him because he might spread coronaviruses. But anyway, who knows how that'll work out. But right now it's a pretty silly season, but a very dangerous one, because unfortunately they don't look at the things that we try to look at, and that is the importance of individual liberty and how that solves so much trouble. If you associate that with private property rights and responsibility, guess what? That's the road to peace and prosperity. That is our goal. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.